A good storyteller knows that a true life story told from personal experience is one of the best ways to draw your audience in and get them to see things from your point of view. And Frank Turek is a good storyteller. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, and we're continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Now, last week we looked at the preface of the book, which I'm pretty sure was written mainly by Dr. Geisler on account of how simply and directly it just tells us that we shouldn't listen to quote-unquote religious skeptics when they advise us to keep in mind folks' biases and agendas. Because after all, the Jews survived the Holocaust, and they's biased against that, but that don't mean they's lying about it. For a scholar like Dr. Geisler, that's how you do it. You don't beat around the bush or waste time on irrelevant anecdotes. You just come right out and tell folks what you got to say. That's how it works in academia, so that's how you do it when you're writing a book for the general public. And I imagine that must have driven Frank Turek just a little bit nuts, 'cause he knows that ain't how you handle an audience of laymen. Frank's a storyteller, and the number one rule of storytelling is show, don't tell. You don't come right out and say that you's telling folks they ought to listen to apologists instead of skeptics. You tell them a story and let them figure that out for themselves. And that's just what we got here in the introduction, which starts off with Frank telling us a story from his own college years. He ain't going to just tell us that skeptics are the bad guys. He's going to show us from his own personal experience. So let's have a look at his story. It starts off dramatically with a college professor in the middle of introducing students to his class on Old Testament literature. Quote, "The university professor gave his wide-eyed undergraduate class a clear warning the very first day of the semester. 'Please leave your religious beliefs at home,' he demanded. 'As we look at the Old Testament, I may make some observations that'll run contrary to what you've been taught in Sunday school. It is not my purpose to offend anyone, but it is my purpose to be as objective as possible in analyzing the text.'" End quote. So notice right away the tone we're setting here. The undergraduates is wide-eyed innocence, like little lambs ready for the slaughter. The professor, the university professor is demanding and is planning on contradicting things these young folks has been taught in Sunday school since they was little. I mean, you can practically hear the ominous background music foreshadowing the doom of these helpless innocents at the hands of the scheming, demanding professor. Then Turek introduces the "I used to be an atheist" trope that's so common in Christian apologetics. He declares that the professor's demands sounded great to him. His whole purpose in enrolling at a secular school was to find out the answer to one question: whether or not God was real. Or at least that's what he claims. Now, I can't read Turek's mind, of course, but I can remember my own experience as an evangelical doing things that I figures was pretty hardcore skeptical, putting God to the test. Looking back, I can see now that it weren't really a fair test, no matter how hard I played the devil's advocate. I was just dabbling in skepticism. Deep down, I knew the end result was just going to be me concluding that God was indeed real, and plus now I'd have some apologetic answers for some hard skeptical questions. I mean, I thought I was sincere, but I was, quote-unquote, sincere in the context of an unshakable certainty that God was real. And that imposed some fixed, invisible limits on just how far I was really going to go in putting him to the test. And Turek's story of young Frank's approach reminds me a lot of my own approach. And notice he says, quote, "What better place to get some objectivity about God and the Bible than a secular school," unquote. Now, people who ain't already committed to religious beliefs generally don't evaluate their college choices in terms of whether the school is secular or religious, especially not in connection with specific religious questions they want answers for. Frank claims that he was looking for the objective truth. He talks like someone who's looking at the world through religion-colored glasses. And I ain't suggesting that Turek is being at all dishonest here. I'm just saying that, from my own personal experience, that when you're deeply religious, that's just how you see things like objectivity and skepticism. In your own eyes, you sincerely and open-mindedly seeking the truth. It's just that in the back of your mind, you already know what the truth is going to turn out to be. And then the rest of it is just finding a way to prove that you're right. So anyway, the very next paragraph uses the show don't tell principle to establish that this professor is unfairly biased against religion. Right from the get-go, he challenges the church tradition that claims that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Or, to use Turek's words, quote, he immediately affirmed the theory, unquote, that Moses didn't write them. There's no mention of any evidence against Mosaic authorship. In Turek's version, it's just the quote-unquote theory in the non-scientific sense. And the same for the Old Testament prophecies being written after the events they supposedly predict. This is the second half of the same sentence, so here again we're supposed to view this as merely a theory which skeptical university professors propose as a way to avoid admitting that there's a God who reveals the future. There's no discussion or even mention of any of the evidence that prophecies in Daniel, for example, were probably written in the 3rd to 2nd century BCE, in other words, after the events they supposedly predict. But remember, this is supposed to be a story about how university professors have religious biases against the Bible. The last thing Turek wants to do here is spark his readers' curiosity about the actual history of biblical texts. And that means he's going to leave out any mention of there even being any evidence to look at. His third example of professorial prejudice is my favorite. Do you know that this guy was so hostile to the Bible that he dared to suggest that the early Jews was polytheistic? This one's my favorite, because you know who else claims that the early Israelites were polytheists? Oh, nobody special, just basically the entire Old Testament. I mean, seriously, what does Turek think the Babylonian captivity was punishment for? Jaywalking? The whole theme of most of the Old Testament prophets was that prior to the captivity, there was high places in Israel dedicated to the worship of other gods, and that was taking God off. And that's why he sent or allowed the Babylonians to conquer the land that he had promised would be Israel's possession forever. So this is a pretty good example of how religion colors a believer's vision. I can remember myself studying the Old Testament passages over and over about how God was condemning and judging the Israelites for their idolatry, and yet somehow it just never really clicked with me that this meant they was polytheists. I was so absolutely certain that Judaism was monotheistic that not even the Bible itself could convince me there was any Jewish polytheists. And Turek apparently still suffers from this because he's using the professor's reference to Jewish polytheism as evidence that the professor is anti-Bible, even though it's the Bible itself that tells us they was polytheists. But now we get to the first major point that Turek really wants to make. After showing us how quote-unquote hostile the professor was, he spends the next several paragraphs introducing us to the sympathetic character whose academic career falls victim to the professor's relentless bias. According to Turek, there's an unnamed student sitting a few rows in front of him who don't like how traditional doctrines is being cross-examined in the classroom. And by the time they make it to Isaiah, the student has had enough, and he yells out that what the professor is doing is wrong. And the professor, predictably, is unyielding. Turek describes him as repeating his initial demand that students leave their Sunday school teachings at home, declaring that, quote, "We will not be able to be objective unless you do that," end quote. To which the student replies, You're not being objective, you're being overly skeptical. And that's the key part of this story. Technically speaking, the words objective and skeptical mean basically the same thing. To be truly skeptical means you do your fact-checking. You cross-examine the evidence, you compare different hypotheses, and then you draw the conclusions that best fits the facts. Granted, absolute objectivity may not be humanly possible, but properly applied skepticism is as close as you're going to get to that ideal. Turek's story, however, spins this 180 degrees by having the sympathetic character declare that being skeptical is the opposite of being objective. And that's exactly the point that Turek wants to show here. He wants his readers to internalize the assumption that skepticism is some kind of anti-Bible bias. Now, if he just came right out and told his readers that skepticism was bad, it wouldn't be as effective. But by telling a story in which the protagonist makes the argument for him, he bypasses the reader's critical thinking and makes an emotional connection that associates skepticism with hostility and persecution. And he reinforces this connection by having other students begin to harass the believer. And the unfortunate faithful student is driven out of the class, never to return. Truly a tragic tale. But the story ain't over yet. Turek declares his sympathy for the student and acknowledges what he calls the professor's, quote, anti-religious bias, unquote, but he still insists that he's interested in what the professor has to say. And he tells us that by the end of the semester he had indeed been persuaded that the Old Testament was not to be taken at face value. Now, why he felt like this, he don't say. This is the closest he ever comes to admitting that the professor was presenting actual, verifiable evidence to back up his quote-unquote anti-religious bias. But of course, Turek ain't going to share any of that evidence with his readers. No, of course not. Instead, it's time for the big climax, the whole point of this story. Remember, at the beginning, he confided in us that his choice of this class, and indeed his choice of the whole school, was made in order to answer one single question. Is God real? And he made it past day one, and he made it past the tragic tale of the true believer, and he made it all the way to the end of the semester. And despite all that he has learned about the history of the biblical texts, he still don't know whether or not God is real. So it's time for the boss battle, the final confrontation. He goes up and asks the professor point blank, "Is there a God?" And the professor responds with the three most terrifying words that an authority figure could say to a member of Frank's target audience. "I don't know." Well, young Frank Turek is stunned by this response. His mind reels. He feels scammed. Here, this professor's been teaching all semester that the Old Testament is, in Frank's words, false. But if God is real, then the Old Testament could be true. How dare this professor not know whether or not God is real? And that's where his story ends. Not with an answer, but with strong emotions, dissatisfaction, and disappointment. The introduction goes on to discuss the moral of this story, and I'm going to save that for the next episode. I think we need to take a few minutes and look over this story as a whole and why it had the particular climax that it did. So remember, Turek is telling this story as part of his introduction to a book entitled I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. His core premise here is that believers have the evidence and skeptics don't, which is why his story carefully avoids mentioning any discussion of the evidence in this class he took. But unfortunately for Turek, that evidence does exist, including evidence in the text of the Bible itself that shows polytheism being practiced and believed by ancient Israelites. So if he's going to claim that there's actual verifiable historical evidence that supports Christianity instead of skepticism, he needs to make sure that his readers have a strong, emotion-driven bias against scholarship and skepticism. And that's what we see in this story. The story of the true believer didn't need to be there from a purely historical sense. Turek could have just said, the professor taught things that contradicted church traditions and one student couldn't take it and dropped out. That would have conveyed the facts of the story in a single line of text. But this ain't a story about facts. It's a story about feelings, especially the feeling that scholarship and skepticism are unjustifiably hostile toward the Bible. Because if Frank Turek just came right out and told us that scholarship and skepticism is unjustifiably hostile towards the Bible, well, and people could just dismiss him as being an anti-intellectual. But by telling an autobiographical story, he bypasses critical thinking and appeals directly to our emotions. We sympathize with the sympathetic characters, and we feel the pain of having our heartfelt beliefs mocked and rejected by prejudiced professors. And so we learn not to trust guys like that. And that's the first major goal of this story. But the primary point, the essential point, is this, that those sneering, callous, demanding, hostile professors ain't got any answers. Or at least they ain't got any answers to the most important questions in life, like, is there a God? When the professor says, I don't know, it ain't that he's being sensitive to the needs of his students, or that he's being careful not to abuse his academic authority in order to avoid proselytizing impressionable young people. No, it's because skeptics ain't got no answers. They destroy other folks' faith and ain't got nothing to take its place. And that's the point. That's the reason Frank introduces his book with this story. In the main body of his book, he's going to try and convince us that the evidence supports Christianity and refutes atheism. But before we can get to his arguments, we have to be in the right frame of mind. We have to be already primed to see scholastics and skeptics as being unfairly biased against religion in general and Christianity in particular. Otherwise, when we hear rebuttals from scholars and skeptics, we might listen to them, and that might not end well for the apologists. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that about does it for me for today. Thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.